It is hard to believe that today is the 1 month anniversary of the Trump 2.0 presidency. Welcome to the To the Contrary podcast. I'm Charlie Sykes, and I'm joined by my good friend Ben Wittes, who used to be on every single week in the before time. So Ben, good to have you back on.
Yeah, it's lovely to see your face, Charlie, but I think if we're talking and it's not about the Trump trials, it's not a good sign.
No, it's not a good sign. Look, I don't like to be the guy that says this. I really work hard not to be the guy that says this, but it's really bad. I mean, today I am feeling it is really bad. And part of it was I was making notes for what you and I would talk about. And I couldn't decide, should we just talk about the assault on the Department of Justice, the complete collapse of the independence of the Department of Justice? Should we talk about Kash Patel, on track to be confirmed as FBI director? Or, and this is where I want to start, Ben, the complete betrayal of Ukraine. And this is one of those moments where we knew it was coming. We warned it was coming. And yet to watch what's happening right now with Marco Rubio sitting across from the Russians, I think I quoted in my newsletter yesterday, Robert Trzynski is saying, a lot of us worried that this would be like Munich. And in fact, it feels more like the Molotov-Ribbentrop alliance that's going on. And I know that you, for our listeners, you have been very, very involved in supporting Ukraine. I mean, you have gone above and beyond, doing things to show solidarity with Ukraine. So let's just start with this, the breathtaking, astonishing betrayal of Ukraine, with Donald Trump now actually parroting Kremlin talking points, blaming Ukraine and the United States for starting Vladimir Putin's genocidal war. It is, well, give me your take on this, because I think it's breathtaking. As somebody that has been predicting this was going to happen, still watching it in real time is gobsmacking.
Yeah, so let's start with the premise that you just articulated, which is that there is at some level nothing surprising about this. Right. If you listened to Donald Trump's statements during the campaign, he promised he was going to do this. If you listened to his statements going back to 2019, he has a vindictive hatred of Ukraine, which, is completely baseless but he seems to feel it. And if you go back to his statements from 2015 and 2016, he has a deeply untoward admiration for Vladimir Putin.
It's like a fetish.
You can call it a fetish. You can call there's something weird about it.
There's something very weird about it.
Rooted in. And so at one level, there is nothing surprising about this.
Yeah.
At another level, I was trying to think of the last time the U.S. had, essentially sided with the bad guys, but not just we've betrayed allies before, right? You leave people behind in Afghanistan, right? The world is an unpleasant place, and we've done a lot of unpleasant things, and I don't want to sugarcoat that. I cannot think of a time when we looked at an authoritarian, totalitarian society waging an unprovoked war against what had been an ally up until the other day, and said, not just blame the victim, but adopted the narrative of the aggressor. I can't think of a time that we've done that. The only example I can think of that's rough, that's similar-ish, is the posture of the America First movement in the run-up to World War II. But of course, they were not the government, they were the opposition, and they were silenced finally by the attack on Pearl Harbor, which completely discredited them. But it's as though, Charles Lindbergh were were president. And I have spent a lot of the last 3 years with Ukrainians. In the night before the Riyadh summit, I went and projected on the Washington Monument with a young Ukrainian woman, "Don't betray Ukraine," in a fashion that was the aim was to be visible from the White House. We knew it was going to happen. And yet there is something just cosmically shocking about watching it happen and watching the United States be very self consciously and deliberatively on the wrong side of a conflict between a genocidal dictator and a democratic country.
I want to stay with this point because it is one thing to appease Vladimir Putin or to make concessions to him, but what you're describing is switching sides, is
Oh,
basically saying that we now have not only let down our NATO allies who have made so many heroic sacrifices, but we've actually switched sides and are embracing Putin's narrative. And this is the part that I think is what makes it so genuinely shocking, because we have lived through Vladimir Putin's genocidal war against Ukraine. There was a broad bipartisan consensus. We saw this in real time. To hear Donald Trump articulating the blame America first line, which used to be just sort of weird conspiracy theorist, fever swamp stuff, is amazing. And the Russians sound genuinely surprised at their good fortune. They sound kind of blown away by the fact that it is the president of the United States who is whitewashing their genocidal war. And I think it was it Lavrov or said, or was one of the spokesmen saying that I believe this is the first time that any statesman has articulated, the fact that, yes, blame Ukraine, blame the United States for all of this, because beyond the wildest dreams of Kremlin propaganda is now coming out of the mouth of Donald Trump, the president of the United States.
well, and it's, from their point of view, Charlie, it's even better than that. Because think about what Congress has done over the last few weeks. It has confirmed Tulsi Gabbard to
Yes.
be the director of national intelligence. Now, if you watch Russian media, which I don't do very much, but I do sometimes, the way they talk about Tulsi Gabbard is the way we talk about, Alexei Navalny. Like she's their girl, and they'll even talk about it that way. We have uh, uh, installed to run this foreign policy on behalf of Donald Trump. We have installed Marco Rubio,
Yeah.
who, as chairman of the Intelligence Committee, as a foreign affairs member of the Foreign Relations Committee, is very tough on Russia. He has now
Was.
been removed from the Senate. He doesn't vote, and he is going to run this policy in a fashion that is, it's a policy that he must know at some level is completely at odds with everything he's ever represented about the region. And so they have stumbled into this incredible good fortune in which the president is spouting their origin story of the war, their talking points, their Tulsi Gabbard is, one of their faves on RT, and she's the new DNI. And even their Republican foes, people like Rubio, have been completely co-opted and turned into instruments of this appeasement.
Okay.
And
So
so they've done. It's been a really good week for Moscow.
oh my God. Yes. No, it has. Okay. I feel like I'm embarrassed to even ask this question because it feels like we've been having this conversation now for 8 years, but can you explain Marco Rubio to me in a way that does not include the phrase dickless? How do you go from Marco Rubio, who is a hardliner on Russia, to the man sitting across the table capitulating to the Russians. I mean, what? Can you explain what's happened? And then I want to get to the Republican supporters of Ukraine in Congress and what they must be thinking now.
Right. So I think that, look, I think the answer to the what happened to Marco Rubio question is really more of a question in your area of expertise than in mine. And there was a very fine book about this subject called How the Right Lost Its Mind. And you have spent the last 8 years
Yeah.
chronicling how people like Marco Rubio went from being people who represented something uh, and something honorable to being people who are willing instruments of the precise opposite of what they've ever.
But even that, this felt like the final frontier, that you had Republicans who were caving into Donald Trump on issue after issue after issue, except for Ukraine. And there was that core belief that we are the United States of America, we have our Western allies, we are the forces of freedom against the forces of tyranny. And now that it just seems to have crumbled, it feels like almost overnight. So I mean, in Marco Rubio's mind, is it so worth it to be? I mean, remember in Trump 1.0, people would take these jobs because they would be the grown up in the room, right? They would be able to stop the worst things that were happening. Jim Mattis was there, and a variety of others. And yet there's Marco Rubio in the room pushing the worst conceivable timeline scenario.
Yeah, so I think the answer to that question is uh, it can only be answered with reference to the economist's idea of revealed preferences, right? Don't and his revealed preferences are that yes, it is so important for him to be Secretary of State that he's willing to be in the room kissing the ass of Sergei Lavrov. And I don't really know if you're asking me to explain
Yeah.
that, I can't.
Yeah.
But I observe that it is true.
All right. So what then does happen? Because there is a very strong bipartisan majority in favor of aid to Ukraine in the Congress. Has that now also just evaporated?
Well, so of course, Democratic support for Ukraine
Yeah.
will operate.
Right.
And, here we get into the question of whether there is a coalition of the vertebrates among
Right.
Republicans. Count me
Yeah.
skeptical that the answer to that question is ever yes. But I do think the Democrats have some leverage here, which is to say that the government's going to shut down in a few weeks, absent a budget agreement that Democratic votes are
Yeah.
necessary for. And so I do think that there's a confrontation coming up in
Yeah.
Congress that Democrats have an opportunity to decide, hey, what are the parts of the first Trump month that we are going to put our foot down and say, we are not giving you a single vote to keep the government open. You can
Okay.
do it entirely
But
on your own, or you can do the following things. And
yeah.
we're going to learn a lot about what Hakeem Jeffries is made of and also what he cares about. Because maybe the answer is he doesn't care enough about Ukraine for that to be on the list. Maybe the answer is
Really?
he cares about American kitchen table issues, or maybe the Democrats see an opportunity here to be the party of our allies overseas who are fighting for their independence, as well as the kitchen table issues. And so, how the Democrats construct their own posture over the next, of which we've had very little hint, by the way, of the next few months, is going to matter a lot. The other thing that matters a lot is what Europe does. And
Yeah.
this arguably matters more because Europe can operate quite independently of Trump, whereas Democrats in Congress, it's a little bit more complicated, as shown by the fact that they appropriate money for all kinds of things and then Trump refuses to spend it, right? So, even if Congress were to do the right thing here, it's actually hard to force the executive to spend money. and that's going to be a matter that the Supreme Court is going to have to resolve.
Well,
So, but Europe, look, this is the crisis. Europe needs to step up. And the good news here, and there's scant good news, but I'm going to give
please
the good
throw
news.
us a scrap. Throw us a scrap.
Force Ukraine into an agreement. They have people on a front. They are fighting. They have the weapons that they have. And Russia is actually incapable of beating them. And so we can negotiate with Russia. We can have a fancy table with Sergei Lavrov on one side and Marco Rubio on the other side. But at the end of the day, Zelensky gets a vote here, whether we put him in the room or not. And you know, I have we can set up terms that are highly disadvantageous to them, but they do get to say no. And if the Europeans can keep them in the fight, and that would require a significant change of European policy. But if the Europeans can keep them in the fight, they can.
Okay.
They don't need our permission.
All right, but that's a big if. Can Europe keep them in the fight? What does it look like? Because again, we're in this extraordinary moment where Europe is suddenly realizing that the United States is not a reliable ally, may actually be an adversary in some of these cases. We've heard reports that Trump is going to pull troops from the Baltic countries. So what can Europe do? What will it look like? Will it look like an army of Europe? Will it look like NATO without America? What can they do practically?
So I am not an expert on European security, but let me offer the following three principles. One, some European countries are extremely cash rich and can finance a great deal in Ukraine if they want. I'm looking at you. Okay?
I'm sorry. What I missed that. You're looking at who?
Norway.
Norway.
Yeah, Norway is per capita the richest country in the world, or one of them. It's basically the United Arab Emirates in the Nordics. It's an enormously capable of writing checks. There are
in an enormously democratic country with really deep traditions of resistance as well.
Yeah.
I mean, people should not underestimate the Norwegians. And I mean that very seriously.
Underestimate in fighting capacity,
right.
In weapons development capacity, people like the Finns and the Estonians. And so there are European countries that are very capable and very eager to help Ukraine. Now, the problem in Europe is two giant countries that are treating this in a little bit too much of the regular order. One is Germany and one is France. So, you have a problem where the closer the countries are to a Russian border, the more sense of urgency they have, with the exception of Slovakia and Hungary. And so the real question is, can the Nordics, which are quite united on this, by the way, and the Eastern European frontline states pull the rest of the European Union with them? And I think there are three components of it. One is keeping Ukraine in the fight. The other is showing Trump, because Trump believes from the bottom of his heart that the Europeans are parasitic and are just taking advantage of the United States and will never say, pardon me, go fuck yourself. Can they just say, we will defend ourselves, we will build our defense industrial complex so that we can do that, and we are not going to rely on the United States? And then number three is an industrial question. We've had trouble building back our defense industrial base to support a rapid response here. The Europeans are even worse. They need to correct that. But I feel I think those of us who are, whether from the traditional left, right, or
Hmm.
center,
Hmm.
whether, who believe in an alliance of democracies, at this point have to support Europe acting without US participation because we are on the wrong side.
Isn't that an amazing thing? That is something, frankly, that I never thought as an American that I would be, and to see us switching to the wrong side, led by the party of Ronald Reagan, it continues to blow my mind. Okay, so one of the big questions is, of course, around Article 5. And we danced around that in Trump 1.0. Article 5, of course, being the NATO treaty that says that we will come to the defense of any NATO member that is attacked. It's only been invoked once when our allies came to our defense after 9/11. Am I correct about this?
That's correct.
Um, so I guess the question is, with Donald Trump essentially inviting Vladimir Putin to go into the Baltic states, at some point, the Europeans are going to have to look Marco Rubio in the eye, or Donald Trump in the eye, or Elon Musk in the eye, and say, okay, are you still going to honor your Article 5 obligations? And I don't know what the answer is. I sense the answer is going to be no. And then
So
what
I,
happens?
I think it is critically important for the Europeans not to beg. And this
Okay.
is this is what Trump wants, right?
Okay.
Because what Trump wants is, he dangles the possibility of U.S. uh, uh,
Support. Yeah.
scuttling NATO, and everybody comes and begs
Oh, no.
him, and then he demands
This is
concessions
so
on things
interesting.
trade, right?
Hmm.
And if you allow, again, I'm not in the habit of
Yeah.
giving countries advice for how to manage the United States, but weird times. If you allow the United States to run an extortion racket against you and a protection racket, NATO will become a protection racket. And that is the one thing
Wow.
worse than not having NATO. Is, that would be actual US
Wow.
imperialism, right? The left has talked about US imperialism for a
Yeah.
long time. We don't extract
Yeah.
resources, right? This would be a conversion of that. Will protect you, will honor our Article 5 commitments. Probably. If you give us highly advantageous trade terms, you're starting to sound a little bit like the British East India Tea Company. Europe cannot
Very
do that.
close.
And so I think the only way to not be in a position where you're begging is to be capable of defending yourself. And Europe is collectively a bigger economy than the United States. It has more people than the United States. It is actually capable of organizing itself and by the way, it has like 4 times as many people as Russia, even before Russia lost 750,000 of them in Ukraine. So Europe
So
can
interesting.
itself against a depleted power if it chooses to, and it needs to
If it
choose,
choose to.
because
Yeah.
the only other option is accepting a protection racket from Donald Trump, and that they cannot do.
Okay, so I want to move on to domestic stuff in just a moment, but you got me stuck here on this, what Europe has to do and whether it will have the political will to do it. And obviously, it's not irrelevant that Elon Musk and JD Vance have been throwing their support behind the, frankly, neo-Nazi party in Germany, because, of course, they now want to play in European politics as a way of undermining the kind of will that you are discussing. So that on the one hand, while Donald Trump is switching sides and aligning himself with Russia, his administration is also undermining the political basis of the Western alliance as well in these elections.
And the
Correct?
two are intimately related because the
Exactly.
party is not just any old neo-Nazi party; it's a pro-Putin party, right? It's an
Sure.
all but openly pro-Russian party. And so, if you imagine your J.D. Vance, Donald Trump, and you are trying to betray Ukraine, and you can get the largest country in Europe, the largest economy in Europe, the cornerstone of the EU, in a pro Putin posture that's very similar to your own, then it becomes very, very difficult to imagine the kind of European coalition that really needs to exist. And so, you have to imagine the Germans are slow enough under a social democratic government,
Yeah.
and it's a big lumbering ship to turn. And now you put it in the hands of a Trump-like party that admires Putin, gets money from the Russians. You're going to have a very, very difficult time, and that will further isolate the Estonians, the Finns, the Poles, who are much closer to the front lines here.
All right. So on this 1 month anniversary, and by the way, every time I say that, we're only 1 month out, it kind of like things go off in my head. So let's talk about what's been happening domestically. You and I used to have a weekly podcast devoted to the Trump trials, and I was thinking about that yesterday. That if somebody would have told us back when we were walking through the various trials and the indictments that nothing would come of it, absolutely nothing, I think that I wouldn't have believed it. You perhaps were more cynical, but you look back on the way that Donald Trump was able to delay and wipe away everything with the help of the U.S. Supreme Court. And now he is a convicted felon, but it doesn't seem to matter to anybody. He comes back into office day one. All the prosecutors are gone, but day one pardons all of the rioters from January 6th, including the ones that attacked the cops. I admit, I knew he was going to pardon the rioters. I didn't think he was going to. I thought he might make a distinction between the violent ones. What did you think? Were you surprised at all about that?
Again, surprised in the same way that I'm
Yeah.
surprised, shocked, not surprised, right?
Right.
Like, I sort of imagined there would be almost everybody except the hardest core. But I also took seriously the things he said. And
I did too, but
he never said the words, "I won't pardon people who were, convicted of killing or attacking cops." And so I tend to think that he is not capable of emotional transparency. And when he says, "I'm going to betray Ukraine," he generally means, "I'm going to betray Ukraine." And
right.
when he says, "I'm going to pardon the January 6ers," he tends to mean he's going to pardon the January 6ers.
Well,
And yes, despite that, I was shocked.
Well, and you and I spent much of 2024 talking about what Donald Trump would do with a presidency based on retribution, how he would weaponize the Department of Justice. And once again, I feel like we're repeating ourselves. Going back to what we said about Ukraine, actually watching it happen is continues to be breathtaking, including the fact that Pam Bondi, who had bipartisan support, some Democrats voted for her to confirm her. She is presiding over exactly the kind of dystopian scenarios that we had discussed. So let's talk about that, because one of the things that began to dawn on me during Trump 1.0 was listening to a lot of folks talk about the norms of the Department of Justice and the traditions of the Department of Justice and the guardrails of the Department of Justice, but then listening closely and realizing most of those are norms and they're sort of on the honor system. And that if the president wanted to blow this up and said, "I want you to indict Ben Wittes, I want you to indict Charlie Sykes," that he has the power. Well, he can do that or drop all of the charges. So in the first Trump term, you could understand why lawyers would want to stay, because they would be in the room and prevent the worst things from happening. Talk to me about the dynamic now of the career lawyers who now have to make this decision. Do I stay or do I go? And last week we had the Thursday night massacre, where you had all of these really elite attorneys from the Southern District of New York. We now had another senior attorney resign, fired. So what is going on, and how badly damaged is the Department of Justice in just the first month?
Well, so let's take the last
Yeah,
question first, because it's the easy one. How badly
yeah,
damaged is it? Terribly badly damaged, and the FBI terribly badly damaged. You know, people don't understand this about the FBI, but you know, a good FBI agent is a it take many years of creation. So
right.
think of like the prosecutors as the elite and the investigators are just kind of the cops. It's kind of
Yeah.
actually the other way around.
Mm,
Like the law schools churn out, the great law schools churn out, hundreds and hundreds of people who can be good prosecutors a year. But an FBI agent, particularly one who works in, you know, bomb forensics or counterintelligence. These are exquisitely specific areas of
mhm,
expertise, and these people are you when you lose one because you force them to retire over a political loyalty matter. You're losing a lot of capacity very quickly, and it's very difficult to replace. Look, what
yeah,
happened at the Justice Department, and people don't connect the norms conversation to the institutional damage, resignation, quitting, and protest conversation. The norms are the only thing that make it ethical to be a Justice Department prosecutor, because
hmm,
you know it is perfectly normal for a justice department for a politician to horse trade with another politician, to say to Eric Adams, hey, I'll vote for
right.
your appropriation if you help me on immigration, right? That's a normal thing for politicians to do. We don't even call it quid pro quoing. We have a respectable
Yeah,
name for horse trading, right? You do that as a prosecutor, you should be disbarred, right?
hmm,
I'll drop charges against you if you help me on
right.
unrelated immigration policy matters, right? If I say to you, as Representative Charlie Sykes, hey, would you oppose Democrats and all their works? And you say, yeah, I'll
Yeah,
fight them
sure.
on the land, seas, and in the air, right? That's a normal thing for a politician to do, oppose the other party, right? You do that as a prosecutor, like that's corrupt. To say Democrats who commit this crime, we're going to let them go, but Republicans we're going to go after. That would be weaponization of the Justice Department. The only thing that prevents that from happening are the norms that say you don't behave that way, the ethical requirements, right? It's not law. It's not, and it's a norm of separating the prosecutorial function from politics. And what Trump did in the first couple of weeks is he ripped that down. He, again, said he was going to do it, right? Went ahead and did it, fired a whole bunch of people for no reason other than that they were politically unreliable, because they had worked on the special counsel's office, because they had worked for on January 6th prosecutions. He goes and he does this. And what happens the next week? Well, once you've established that the president can reach down into the Justice Department and say, hey, I like this guy, Eric Adams, drop charges against him, you've gotten rid of that wall that says, hey, we're going to insulate the Justice Department people from these inherently political decisions. We're going to let them be pure. And we're going to, and so what happens? You put them in an ethically untenable position within just a few weeks of
Yes.
taking office, and they, being irrespective of whether they're Democrats or Republicans, Scalia clerks or
Hmm.
Chief Justice Roberts clerks, they respond the same way, which is, I'm sorry, Dave, I'm afraid I can't do that. And they
Hmm.
quit. And so you have, because actually the normal horse trading for a politician. And actually, one of the prosecutors who resigned in a letter said, I understand why the administration wants to do this, but
Sure.
no respectable AUSA would file this motion for these reasons.
But
And
you'll find a fool or someone who's dumb enough or cowardly enough to do it, and of course they did.
and of course they did, but here's the key line, but it was never going to be me.
I
Right.
love that.
And so, and that is, somebody who clerked for the Chief Justice. And I think the really important lesson here, which is what I've been screaming about this for 8 years, is the norms aren't there so that we're nice to each other. They're not there. It's not like some bullshit political comedy thing.
It's not etiquette.
It's not etiquette. It's the only thing that makes it ethically acceptable to be a Justice Department prosecutor. The moment you take it away, it becomes ethically impossible to work for the Justice Department. And so people quit. And that, by the way, it's not going to stop, because if you insist, it'll be fine for people who do, routine, non-political sensitive cases. But if you work on something that the political echelon cares about, someday you're going to get a phone call that says,
Right.
Make sure you come down hard on Wittes or Sykes, or make sure
Right.
you go easy on Wittes or Sykes. And you're going to have to say, I'm sorry, Dave, I'm afraid I can't do that,
Yeah.
or Emil, and you're going to have to quit. And that's what last week was about.
So yeah, it did feel like last week. Well, you tell me what the mood has been, because I think there was a little bit of waiting and watching and trying to figure out, it's going to be bad. How bad will it be? But it felt like those resignations, which were so eloquent and full throated, might have also inspired others, because in the context of watching one institution in government and out of government, one institution after another bend the knee to Donald Trump, the premature capitulations. It really did seem like a clarion call when this one lawyer said, it was never going to be me. The acting U.S. attorney who had been put there by the Trump folks essentially said, this is a quid pro quo, called them out. I mean, just laid it out in very, very clear language. So what is the mood? Did that inspire others to say, I want to be like them rather than Emil Bovee, the low rent Roy Cohn knockoff that is apparently calling the shots?
Yes. So Emil Bovee, whom I had the privilege to spend 6 weeks in court with when he was, line counsel in the Trump defense in New York. Look, Emil Bovee is a very smart man. He is a very yes.
Okay.
He is a very capable lawyer, and he is all in for the devil right now. And we should not underestimate his capability. He is okay forcing the resignations of a lot of the Justice Department's career expertise. And that is an extremely dangerous thing. But yes, that said, I agree with you. What we've seen from the Justice Department, and frankly, less visibly from the Bureau, has been inspiring. The problem is you're going to have a lot of inspiring resignations, and they're not going to be there. And the people who are going to be elevated in their places are people who are going to be the ones who are willing to sign documents. And that is a very worrisome thing. It's also playing out at all of these other agencies too. And so, I have mixed feelings about it. Part of me would rather, it is a problem that it is an ethical selection process for the least ethical.
I mean, that is the dilemma. I remember, we're talking about last Thursday, when the resignations came down, I thought this is a good thing. I'm glad that they are doing that. And the pushback was, well, I'm guessing the Trump folks are delighted by this. This is what they want. They want all of these ethical lawyers to go so they can replace them with a Trumpified lawyer. But I guess the point is that if it's widespread enough, will it, as you point out, it's not easy to find FBI agents. Is it? I mean, is it going to be easy for them to stock the SDNY with people willing to sell out their legal reputations?
So, I mean, I think this is a very profound and important question. And the
Yeah,
honest answer is, well, we know the answer in the case of the FBI. It's very hard. You have to put them through Quantico. You have to
yeah,
like creating an FBI agent is a problem, and it's hard, and they already have recruitment issues. Creating, uh, what the Southern District of New York will continue to exist. It will just continue to exist as a much less elite prosecution office, right? It'll be much less good at things like public corruption. But that's actually the point, right? That's what they want.
yeah.
Now, one really interesting question here, and one of the very elegant features of what Danielle Sasson did, the acting U.S. attorney, she could have written that letter in a couple paragraphs, and she wrote
Yeah,
it
8 pages.
eight single spaced pages. And the audience for that was, principally not the press, though the press latched right onto it. And, it was the letter that sparked 1,000 news stories. But her audience was a judge, a judge named Judge Ho, who happens to be the guy who's presiding over the case. Now, I believe that a hearing on that is happening today.
Yesterday, actually, but yeah.
Was it yesterday? Um,
Yeah.
sorry. Let me. Yes, exactly. Yesterday, I believe a hearing on that happened yesterday. I have, because we are recording this a day early, I
Mhm.
have not yet seen the results of that hearing. Um, Look, this is a very unusual presentation of a question before a
Oh,
federal
yeah.
judge, which is the prosecutor appointed by this president
Hmm.
um, alleges that the acting deputy attorney general tried
Yeah.
to force her to engage in a quid pro quo deal with a criminal defendant, acknowledging that the charges were merited. And she has blown the whistle on this in considerable detail, and he has responded, but not challenged the facts of her contention. And so, I think one question that we have here is, first of all, does the judge allow the dismissal of the case under these circumstances? That is, normally it is a pretty ministerial thing when the Justice Department wants to drop charges against you. The courts don't stand in the way. But here you have a genuinely unusual situation that I think a judge in that district is likely to take a very close look at. And then, second, what message does that send to other prosecutors
Okay. Well,
at
also, because you got me thinking about something here. You mentioned that she writes this 8 page letter, which was really the audience of one, but maybe not just the audience of one. She obviously knows that the entire judiciary is watching this as well, and that's the part we haven't gotten to yet, with the attempt to break down all the norms in the FBI, break down all the norms in the Department of Justice. Well, there's a third branch of government that also gets a vote in all of this, and it is interesting that these some of the strongest pushback against what's happening are coming from judges. I mean, coming from prosecutors with very, very solid conservative credentials, Federalist Society members, people who had clerked for Justice Roberts. The Supreme Court justices are reading this too, aren't they? Appeals court judges are reading this as well. And so I wonder, I don't disagree with anything you're saying, that she was obviously, addressing this to Judge Ho, but also she's also creating a record. It feels like sending up a flare. This is not normal. This is not usual. You need to understand what is happening here. And somebody that a Justice Roberts is going to take seriously a
Yes.
Justice Kavanaugh is going to take seriously, a Justice Barrett is going to take seriously, because right now the judges have to realize that they are the last remaining guardrail under the Constitution. And we don't really know how they're going to hold up, do we? Because
No.
we get,
We,
yeah,
and mostly that question is presenting in civil challenges to Trump
right.
administration action. This is a challenge in the context of a criminal case to Trump administration corrupt refusal to act. And it's a very different presentation of the question than some of these others, and it has an incredibly attractive pair of faces, which is Danielle Sassoon, the
Mm-hmm.
former attorney, and the line attorney, Hagen Scotton, who
Very impressive.
"It's Never Going to Be Me" letter. These are people who are now sort of like almost basically fact witnesses at this point to an alleged corrupt deal. And I think that is going to be an interesting question, how Judge Ho handles it in the first instance, how the Second Circuit and the Supreme Court handle it potentially down the road, and finally, how that, as you say, percolates across the judiciary and critically among the other AUSAs in the Southern District of New York and elsewhere.
No, exactly. And of course, I feel like we're burying the lead here, because it was just a few days ago that the President of the United States quoted Napoleon Bonaparte, allegedly Napoleon Bonaparte, claiming, he who saves the nation cannot break the law, essentially saying that he is above the law. And of course, proved in 2024 that he was, in fact, above the law. That seemed to many people, to be a very direct challenge/threat to the courts, that I am prepared to ignore you and to defy you and create a constitutional crisis. So how does that play? Do Supreme Court justices look at that and go, okay, he doesn't mean he's blowing it off? Or do they say that what Trump is really saying, nice court you got there, Justice Roberts. It'd be a shame if I had to reveal and expose that it was all a sham, that it was all a bluff, that I don't have to follow your rulings. How does that play with the courts?
So we don't know,
We don't.
right? The question of would Trump at the end of the day defy a court order, and what would happen if he did, is one of those questions that everybody likes to jump to early. And I want to actually hold back on that, um, by way of dealing with the proximate issues first, right? So before he defies a court order, he's going to appeal it.
Yeah.
And I want the order that is finally there, that he's got to decide whether to follow or not. I want it to have as many justices on it as possible. And
Right.
it's different if it's a 5-4 thing, than if it's a 7-2 or 9-0 thing, right? It's different if it's the court rather than the justices least friendly to Trump. It's different if the person defying the court order is Trump himself, or if it's maybe Elon Musk or some
Right.
kid, 19-year-old named Big Balls who works for Elon Musk, right? And so,
He's going
I
through our IRS data right now, probably. And
exactly.
the
Well,
19-year-old kid named Big Balls.
look data. Look, you can't not take the threat seriously because he's making the threat, and that is and he's getting encouragement in that from the vice president, from senators, from opinion leaders, and so you have to take it seriously. But I do think it's important not to catastrophize and jump to
Okay.
and say he's going to defy a court order because he might. And I want to actually follow the process out and posture that court order as strongly as possible by way of disincentivizing it.
So what do you think the big Supreme Court case of 2025 will be? Will it be on impoundment? Will it be on some other issue? What's the one that will be the decisive answer to the question, will the court be a guardrail against Trumpian excess?
So I think there's, broadly speaking, 3 or 4 different issues that the court is going to have to address. They're all big. They're very different from one another. First of all, there's the birthright citizenship stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, that one's a relatively easy question.
We thought immunity was too, though.
Exactly, right? So, Trump hasn't won a single motion in a single court on that subject, but you don't want to make assumptions about where the Supreme Court is. Number 2, impoundment. Right? He is trying to create a revolution in the relationship between the branches of government by interpreting the idea that Congress holds the purse strings to mean Congress holds one of the purse strings and the president holds the other. The Congress can appropriate the money, but the president has an independent judgment as to whether to spend it. If he can get that by the court, that is a revolution in American constitutional separation of powers law. If he cannot get that through the court, that is a major, major, major setback for him. And there's a foreign policy element of that, and there's a domestic side of it. They're both hugely, hugely important. Number 3, and this is the one that I think he is most likely to win on, is the president's Article 2 power to fire people in the bureaucracy. Now, he has postured this in the most unsympathetic possible way, terminating a whole bunch of bird flu people by accident, right?
What could go wrong?
But, there is at the Supreme Court, there is a idea that has caught on over the last, really 40 years, that the president has to have vertical hiring and firing authority across the executive branch under what's called the Appointments Clause. And this has 2 presentations that are relevant now. One is, can he fire people who are appointed for terms to independent agencies, right? A little bit further down, can he fire inspectors general who have you're only supposed to be able to fire them with with what's called cause, right, for a reason. But can he do it just because, he runs the executive branch? And then the extreme version of this question is, can he fire civil servants, right? The civil service has been around since after the Civil War to get rid of the Jacksonian spoils system, right? That every guy who runs a lighthouse is, gotta be a friend of the president's. Was that system always a myth constitutionally? And so these questions...
Wow. That would be, yeah.
Just to finish the thought, I'm pretty confident that he's going to win on the independent agencies question. And so I think, you're going to see there's some real, he's got some real arguments based on current case law that, he gets to fire, Democratic appointees who supposedly serve a term of years. I think he's going to lose on the civil service stuff. And so, how he does matters as to what that order is going to be that he might be tempted to defy.
Yeah, no, but again, we're just in the first month, and these are the big questions, and there's no question about it that he's aiming for a constitutional revolution. I mean, he is looking for not just incremental change, but really, a fundamental shift in power. Benjamin Wittes, thank you so much for joining me for what I think is one of the smartest podcasts I have ever hosted. Thank you so much. We covered an awful lot of ground. It's good to be back with you.
It's so good to see you again. I'm so glad your voice is back in my ears, and congratulations on the new podcast.
Well, thank you. And thank you all for listening to today's To the Contrary podcast. I'm Charlie Sykes, and we do this several times a week because we all need to remind ourselves that we are not the crazy ones.